a decade has now passed since the Arab Uprisings, when people across the Middle East took to the streets in huge numbers to demand dignity, human rights and democratic reform. But just how much has really changed? And with global crises such as climate change and soaring food prices fueling political and economic pressures in the region once again, could the revolutionary fire be reignited? Back in 2010, social unrest spread throughout the Middle East after a street vendor set himself alight outside a government building in Tunisia. Mohammad Bouazizi's desperate act of protest, which came in response to harassment from local authorities, proved a catalyst that ignited massive popular mobilizations across the region. Simmering public anger over poverty, corruption, the cost of basic foods, and the behaviour of political elites who seemed more interested in enriching themselves than building a just society erupted into the streets. The protest movements, many of them organised by women, demanded radical reforms, and in some countries like Egypt, Libya and Tunisia, long-standing regimes were toppled. But other governments across the region responded with draconian crackdowns and emergency laws, and democratic principles like transparent electoral processes and freedom of expression have been undermined instead of advanced. Continued questions about the role of Islam within politics has also played a key role in local and regional affairs. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood capitalised on the protest movement, and Mohammad Morsi became the first democratically elected Islamist president before he was deposed in a coup that returned the country to military control. States across the region were worried about the rising influence of political Islamism. The Saudi Arabian leadership grew increasingly worried about Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups, along with its relationship with Iran, eventually leading a group of allies in a blockade of the country. Daesh, meanwhile, took advantage of instability in Iraq and Syria, spreading rapidly across the territories of both countries in 2014, before being pushed back by a counter-offensive. In other countries, those in power deployed a range of strategies, including using sectarian rhetoric to push back on the pressure for reform. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran, which were also feeling the pressure for domestic reform, sought to leverage old divisions, both within their countries and abroad, in order to shore up their support. By and large, counter-revolutionary efforts have succeeded in pushing down the protest movements. The issues that underpinned ordinary people's frustrations, from poverty and inequality to youth unemployment, corruption, and lack of democracy, remain central in the lives of many, however. Millions of people have meanwhile been displaced from Syria, Yemen, and Libya, while government corruption is worsening and youth unemployment remains sky-high. And the war in Ukraine is now adding to the desperation of ordinary people across the region as food prices have soared. Egypt, for example, imports 80% of its grain from Russia and Ukraine. Yemen, which was already beset by civil conflict, is likewise dependent on the two warring nations for its food supplies, as are Lebanon and Syria. Across the Middle East, the war in Ukraine is driving a major nutritional crisis. Russia's political and trade relationships across the Middle East have grown significantly stronger since the Arab Uprisings, and many governments have been reluctant to condemn Moscow for the invasion. China has likewise ramped up its involvement through the Belt and Road Initiative, helping build ports and infrastructure across the Middle East and thereby increasing its influence. Meanwhile, many believe the United States is deprioritizing the Gulf, while Europe is widely seen as ineffective. China has also taken a leading role in brokering détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, further strengthening its sway. But far from the halls of power, people on the ground are still fighting for change and finding new ways to bring their voices to the fore. In Yemen, for example, as the state fragments, localized eruptions of artistic and musical expression continue to amplify calls for change. Something similar is unfolding in Iraq and Lebanon, where creative voices are amplifying calls for reform. Across the Middle East, conditions remain tough, but the desire and demand for fairer societies has not been silenced. How the powerful choose to respond to this hunger for change will shape the destiny of the Middle East for years to come.